Welcome to this Guerrilla Feminist Collective screening of Buying Sex and Feminist panel. This event is taking place on occupied traditional and ancestral Musqueum land. This recognition is central to our discourse tonight, as First Nations women are massively overrepresented in the sex trade, with over 800 missing and murdered women in Canada, which our government does not think important enough to open a national inquiry about. We're grateful for the participation of our panel speakers tonight, Professor Janine Benedet, Yuly Chan, Daisy Kler, Summer Rain Bentham, and Jackie Lynne. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to our first speaker, Janine Benedet.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this screening and this panel discussion. I think in the few minutes that I have with you in this portion of the presentation, getting a bit of feedback, so maybe turn that off, I'd like to just explain to you a little bit about the court case that you saw sort of 2/3 of in the film, my role in it, and where we are now in just sort of the process of law reform. And that may be useful just for setting the stage for the discussion that's going to follow. So in this case, the Bedford case, I acted as co-counsel for 7 women's groups, Aboriginal, Anglophone and Francophone women's groups from across Canada, who came together to intervene in the Bedford case as the Women's Coalition for the Abolition of Prostitution. The Women's Coalition has a website, www.abolitionprostitution.ca, and you can find our factum there from the Supreme Court of Canada. You can actually go on the Supreme Court of Canada's website and watch people make argument at the Supreme Court of Canada if you want as well. But we actually came together before the Ontario Court of Appeal decision, recognizing that there was a grave concern here that equality and equality rights were being completely left out of the legal decision, that the applicants were focusing on security of the person and arguing about whether it was possible to make really marginal improvements in women's safety by removing the existing laws. The government, of course, wanted to criminalize everyone, again arguing that that was a better regime, but there was no one who was prepared to point out what we thought was the obvious fact, that those prostitution laws, of course, covered not only prostitutes, who are mostly women, but also the buyers and the pimps, who are, in the case of the buyers, almost exclusively men, and in the case of the pimps, mostly men. And that, in fact, those actors played different roles in the prostitution transaction, and that they ought to be understood as a hierarchy, as a relationship of power. And so we intervened in the court, first at the Ontario Court of Appeal. And it was interesting, at the Ontario Court of Appeal, I had more time. I had 30 minutes to speak to the court, which was great, and a longer factum as well. And the whole process was much longer at that level. And by that point, I had listened to 3 days of legal argument from the applicants and the government. And when I stood up to make my remarks, the first thing I said to them was that in 3 days, 3 full days of listening to legal argument, I did not hear the word Aboriginal or any of its synonyms mentioned once by anyone on either side. And I had not heard the words Johns or buyers or clients or any of the synonyms that were being used for that term mentioned either. And so it was as if we were having 3 days of legal argument that failed to recognize both, you know, the fundamental fact that the very women everybody kept talking about as disappearing and being murdered were overwhelmingly Aboriginal women, and that somebody was actually buying them and profiting from them and killing them, but those things were completely absent from the discussion. Unfortunately, the Ontario Court of Appeal, as you saw in the film, chose to make the relevant distinction one based on location rather than the actors involved, which was not the result that we were seeking. We thought it was very telling that for a long time the applicants seemed content with that result and seemed prepared to sacrifice the women on the street if it only meant that they could open brothels. But ultimately, the whole case was appealed to the Supreme Court of Canada, where we intervened again, but there had only 10 minutes and 10 pages, which is pretty hard to get some traction for an entirely third way of thinking about prostitution. But you can go online and watch if you want and see me try for 10 minutes. Anyway, I'm not going to go watch it again. So as a result of that process, which you don't see in the film because it came afterwards, the Supreme Court of Canada reverted to the original decision of Justice Himmel and declared all three of those provisions to be unconstitutional. And the court, in its reasons, although recognizing, interestingly, that most women in prostitution were not there by choice and that it was those women that needed to be the focus of law and public policy, did not even engage with our argument in order to reject it. They simply, I would say, colluded in rendering the Johns invisible one more time. The court, however, did suspend its declaration of invalidity for 12 months, which is typical in constitutional cases, to give the government time to craft new legislation that would be consistent with that decision. And so that started on December the 20th, I guess, of 2013. So we're in that 1 year period right now. And my understanding from having spoken to people in all three political parties is that we should expect draft legislation either in the late spring or in the early fall, either just before or just after the legislative break in Parliament. I don't know what that legislation will say, but I do think it's important to understand, particularly for those of us who have been working so hard to bring the model that's in place in Sweden forward to both the public consciousness, which I think we've succeeded in doing a lot more than I ever thought we would, but also to bring that forward to parliamentarians who are going to be crafting this new law, that there's not only pressure from those who want to completely decriminalize the sex industry, as in New Zealand, but there's also pressure on the other side from those who want to recriminalize the women. Whether it's some women or women on the street or women who can show that they weren't for or something, some version of recriminalizing women in prostitution. So the reality is that we are struggling on both fronts, both to resist the complete normalization and the complete embrace of a commercial sex industry that validates men's demand. And on the other side, we are resisting a push to recriminalize women so that police can rescue them and bring them the services that really are delivered much more effectively by the frontline women's movement, as you'll hear. So that's the place that we're in, and there are lots of opportunities for people who are interested in this issue to get involved, to be heard, and to make your views on this issue known. And so we can talk more about that a little later in the evening. Thank you.
So thank you, Jen and your group, for inviting the Asian Women Coalition Ending Prostitution to speak on this panel tonight. So we are an Asian feminist organization united around the struggle to abolish the racist and sexist practice of prostitution. We were formed in 2005 by members who were working at a rape crisis center who recognized that many of the women they were helping were Asian women who came to Canada in search for a better life, but who ended up having to sell themselves for a living. So much of our current work centers on raising awareness about the harms of prostitution and trafficking of Asian women, as well as educating ourselves around the current situation. We were granted intervener status in the Supreme Court case that was outlined in the documentary. Asian women have a major stake in how society chooses to deal with prostitution. Here are some facts that demonstrate why. In the Lower Mainland, 30% of the population is of Asian descent. Here at UBC, more than 40% of the student population is reported to be of Asian descent. Police raids of massage parlors in Vancouver show that more than 90% of women in these underground brothels are Asian women. Massage parlors in Vancouver are found in every major neighborhood. In fact, last year, I found out through CBC News that there was a massage parlor across the street from my house where a woman was trafficked from China to have sex with her customers. Our group intervened in Bedford versus Canada, focusing on the issue of keeping a body house. Gwendolyn Allison, a lawyer based in Vancouver, and Christine Boyle, professor emeritus here at UBC, represented us. One of the things that I wanted to point out was that it's important to remember that the intervention process is limited in scope and only allows interveners to argue about existing laws. So although we knew that our submission to the court would not give a full picture of our position, we still felt compelled to highlight the current situation and challenges and potential effects of the constitutional changes. The decriminalization of brothels would normalize and entrench the racism and exploitation of women of color in several ways, including that it will become normal and accepted for Asian women to work within these brothels, and the recruitment of women of color through racist, sexist, and dehumanizing acts and tactics, and normalizing men's behavior under this context. Racist stereotypes are used against Asian women in prostitution. Exotic, new in town, and geisha doll are some of the common stereotypes that we see. These stereotypes are tools used to market Asian women and men to men, as well as provide an expectation for what the buyers might demand in the behavior and sex acts from Asian women. These stereotypes also reinforce much broader societal attitudes and expectations of women and women of color, whether prostituted or not. On December 20th, 2013, the Supreme Court of Canada struck down the 3 laws, and what Janine outlines, struck down the 3 laws prohibiting the living off the avails of prostitution, keeping a body house, and soliciting for the purposes of prostitution. So on the one hand, it was a victory that the judges ruled in favor of decriminalizing women in prostitution. The Supreme Court also recognized that many women in prostitution have no meaningful choice, and it is important for the government not to increase their vulnerability to the violence of pimps and johns. But on the other hand, we were alarmed by the fact that in striking down the laws as they applied to men who engage in prostitution as brothel keepers, pimps, johns, and advertisers, the courts did not take into account the profoundly racist and sexist nature of prostitution. In fact, the safety of prostituted women is being used to mask the fact that those who buy and profit from the selling of women's bodies will no longer be punishable under law, and ultimately giving approval to men to indulge in racist stereotyping of women for sexual purposes. As Janine mentioned, Parliament now has a year to pass laws that are more consistent with charter values of racial and sexual equality, as well as security of the person. However, we have to remember that this is happening under the most reactionary government that Canada has had in decades. The broader social and economic issues of inequality must be addressed to improve the conditions of women's lives that are making them vulnerable to prostitution. This is one of the key aspects of the Nordic model, which I hope we'll get to discuss a little later on. One of the key aspects of the model is that one of the focuses on allocating resources to help women to exit prostitution in addition to criminalizing the buyers and pimps in prostitution. In Canada, we see the exact opposite. Austerity measures leading to increasing cuts to social services, immigration, high cost of living, and lack of jobs disproportionately affect women of color, and Aboriginal women. Adding to this, Asian women are facing an onslaught of sexualized racism through the expansion and growth of the sex industry, which has a real impact on our full social and political participation in Canadian society. Asian-born immigrant women often come to Canada in search for a better life for themselves and their families. While there are certainly Asian women who are tricked and trafficked into prostitution, most women end up in prostitution for economic reasons and because of the expectation in Asian cultures that daughters must sacrifice themselves to support their family as a means to escape poverty. As an immigrant myself, I experienced what so many other working-class immigrant women have faced in Canada. Poverty, racism, social isolation, language barriers, unemployment, and in many instances, an overwhelming sense of powerlessness over the conditions of my life. However, I made the decision to become active in political and feminist organizations like the Asian Women Coalition so that I could understand and share my experiences with like-minded women and also work collectively towards a society that provides genuine and dignified opportunities for all women. One of my favorite quotes from African American writer and activist Assata Shakur is, "Our desire to be free has got to manifest itself in everything we are and do." I believe that prostitution fundamentally undermines the feelings of solidarity and genuine equality between men and women in society. And I think that all of us have an important contribution to make in advancing the changes we want to see for women's equality and liberation. Thank you.
Do you want me to just introduce myself?
Sure. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Daisy Kler. I'm a collective member at Vancouver Rape Relief and Women's Shelter. I'm also a member and founder of the South Asian Women Against Male Violence, which I didn't mention to the group, but I think is kind of important in this context because we've also taken a position against the legalization of prostitution. So I'm here today actually to talk to you a little bit about why would a rape crisis center and a transition house intervene in Bedford? What do we see as the reasons why we have an interest as frontline workers in this case or in this topic? So first I wanted to just check, how many of you followed the Bedford case? Just put up your hand. So quite a few of you did. Wow, okay, that's great to know. So a little bit about Rape Relief. We're a collective of women. We run a 24-hour rape crisis line, and we run a transition house for women who are escaping male violence. We house about 120 women and their children a year, and we answer about 1,200 new crisis calls every year. Those are from women who are either trying to prevent violence from happening to them, or they're already resisting attacks from men. So I've been there about 15 years in different capacities as a volunteer and as paid staff. And I've worked with many women who've escaped prostitution. Some of them are still in prostitution when they come to our house, and some of them are trying to exit. I'm going to focus mostly on the women who live in the transition house, but we also have many callers who may never live in the house but are calling us because they're trying to escape a violent pimp, who sometimes is also their boyfriend or husband. So I mostly work in the transition house, and just today actually I was working in the transition house, and we have a woman, an Aboriginal woman, who is exiting prostitution. This is her second or third time around trying to get away from a boyfriend who also ends up being her pimp. And I asked her what she wanted me to say to you. And she wanted me to say to you that no woman chooses prostitution. In fact, what she said is that I didn't wake up one day as a little girl and decide to become a prostitute. It's like what one of the women said in the film, Prostitutes Are Made. She also wanted to talk a little bit about, I asked her, because one of the questions was, what is the relationship between prostitution, Aboriginal women, and colonization or racism? And she responded by saying that 95% of her Johns were white men. So I think it probably answers quite a bit just in her answer. So she said I could use her name, but I don't think it's that useful to do that. But I wanted to bring, I guess, to you what we're dealing with on a daily basis and what she is. So I don't think there's been a month that's gone by in the transition house that I haven't met a woman who has been in prostitution. And that's not because our house is full of prostituted women. It's because at some time in their lives they may have had to do that. And they may be coming to us because they're escaping a violent husband. But somewhere in their lives they've had to resort to prostitution. So in my experience, there hasn't been a month where we haven't been working with someone in the house that's been in prostitution. None of them have told me that they chose it. None of them said they wanted this life for their children. All of them said they could only really talk about it once they were out. Some of them had admitted that while they were in it, they would have told you that they were choosing it. They thought this was a way to bear the horrors that many of them had to face. The horrors of being accessed by 10 to 15 men, being beaten, being threatened. And a lot of them had to use drugs and alcohols to numb the kind of daily humiliation and degradation of prostitution. And she wanted me to make sure that I said that the addiction was part of how to cope with prostitution. So some of the things that I wanted to say to you about prostitution comes from the fact that when we do the work with women about male violence, prostitution is part of the spectrum of male violence. There's incest, there's rape, there's wife assault, and there's prostitution. We don't see it as something different than what we when we talk about male violence against women. Prostitution is within that spectrum. We don't see it as a separate issue. And for us, that's why it was important for us to intervene in Bedford, because this issue affects all women. No woman is free from rape or the fear of rape. So the fear of male violence against us is ever present. It's in trafficking and prostitution, we just see the extreme examples of the violence that women face. The experience of male violence, of course, is not reserved for women in prostitution. In fact, very few women get to live their lives free from violence. But prostitution highlights how the intersection of poverty and racism and sexism functions as a vice grip on women's ability to be free. So there's some stats. There's a stat. There's 40 million prostituted women around the world. So it's a larger population than Canada and twice the population of Australia. Prostitution is regulated in 22 countries, and the average age of entry into prostitution, like we heard, is between 14 and 17 in some cases. You can see in the film we were talking about prostitution being both a reflection of and a product of women's oppression. It's a function that keeps all of us subjugated. It does so by reinforcing patriarchy, where all women are seen as objects. And once we're objectified, we can be considered objects to be bought and sold, and to be seen existing solely for the servicing of men. And once we're objectified or dehumanized, it's much easier to beat us and rape us. Prostitution, like all forms of violence against women, relies on the vulnerability of women. So if women are made vulnerable by forces of imperialism, colonization, and patriarchy, then we're delivered to traffickers and pimps. Men take advantage of every vulnerability that's forced on women. So if we're poor, damaged by other assaults, incested, runaways, single mothers, if our self-image is badly damaged, if we're forced out of our homelands, we don't have citizenship, if we don't have unsafe or no housing, if we are isolated or disabled, men use the knowledge that police won't respond to the violence against us, that there's no criminal justice system that holds men accountable for rape. All these facts are used to attack us. So surely there's some of the ways forward to eliminate what makes women vulnerable. While answering the crisis lines, I was told by women time and time again, if they had money, if they had been protected from incest by their fathers, brothers, or uncles, if they had a way to get childcare, if they had detox services, proper police response to the violence they had experienced, they wouldn't have been in prostitution. Women who were trafficked, whether it was from poor rural reserves in Canada or from poor countries of the global south, tell us they were forced to migrate out of dire poverty and a hope for a chance for a better life. So for me, hearing the stories in the house and on the lines, there is no separation for me about the work that I do, ending male violence and fighting on the front of prostitution. It's one and the same thing. And we intervened in Bedford because we knew this was an important case and that it was going to change the landscape, not just legally about what was going to happen to women by law, but on the ground. What would that mean for all of us if it was legally sanctioned to buy and sell women and children? And we know that children are going to be sold in prostitution. So we intervened for that reason. And also because we see prostitution as part of the spectrum of violence against women. It is in our interest. And we wanted to hold men responsible for the buying and selling of women. And we wanted to be able to say, don't criminalize the women and children in prostitution. Keep the eyes and the focus on the men and take it off the women and give them support services. We know that just decriminalizing prostitution, decriminalizing the women in prostitution isn't enough. We're going to have an adequate welfare system. We're going to have adequate detox. We're going to have to get the police to respond to male violence. We're going to have to do a lot of things. This is just one remedy, but it's a really important one, and I hope we get to talk about what you guys can do about it as well. And I do think it's not only hearing from prostituted women that you make your decision on. You have to make a decision whether you've heard something or not, because I think you're obligated as human beings to take a stand, and one way or the other, what you decide is right, and take an interest in it, because this is going to affect everybody. So, thanks.
Thank you. I'll just begin by saying that I'm Lynne, and I'm a co-founder, along with Sherry Smiley, of Indigenous Women Against the Sex Industry. Oh, by the way, I did time this at home, and I hope I don't go over 30 minutes. I don't want to rush, so I'm asking for your patience if I do. All right? Okay, thank you. So, Indigenous Women Against the Sex Industry, AWASI, the acronym is AWASI, is a new organization we launched in April of last year, at which time I told my personal story, and it was podcasted on Feminist Current. I don't know if there are those of you in the room that have listened to it. If you have, then, well, you're going to have to listen to it again. But I make no apologies for that, because I do believe that it bears repeating. And so, Sherry's not able to be with us tonight, but she stands with us in spirit and in solidarity. At the moment, she's away in Ottawa, strategizing with other equality-seeking and freedom-fighting abolitionists on the best ways and means of implementing the Nordic model here on Canadian soil. I'm a proud woman of the Métis Nation, and I am descended from the Cree Nation on my mother's side. I have European blood in me, but because I don't know who my father is, I don't know which other nations run in my blood. I would like to take a moment to acknowledge and to honor my mom, who survived decades of prostitution. I'd like to also take a moment to honor myself for my strength and my courage to share my story with you. My mom is no longer with me, but when she was alive, she knew of my abolitionist aims, and she was proud of them. She gave me permission to speak of her life in my work, because she also wanted to educate others for social change. Tonight, I will speak to how normalized and how prevalent male sexual violence is in the lives of First Nations women. And I will do so by giving you snapshots from my mother's life and from my own as well. I don't want to feel like I'm reading from a page, but I also know I don't want to get lost, so bear with me in the pauses, would you? Thanks. By my life, I will show you how childhood sexual abuse is intimately connected to prostitution. I will speak to the overrepresentation of First Nations women in prostitution. And I will invite you to imagine a world wherein prostitution does not exist. We can have such a world. Prostitution is not a social inevitability, and it is not a cultural imperative. It can be stopped. It can be abolished. It wasn't that very long ago that our neighbors to the south said slavery would always exist. They pointed to history to prove it. They said no, the auction block was here to stay, and that slaves were happy in the masses' house. They didn't want their freedom, and besides which, if they did get it, they probably wouldn't know what to do with it. Abolitionists of yesteryear were told we had it all wrong. As it turns out, we didn't, and slavery was abolished. And abolitionists of today, we're not wrong either. Prostitution can be abolished, and it needs to be abolished because it is a multi-billion-dollar industry of domination built on the suffering of women worldwide, the majority of whom are Indigenous women. Gender equality and freedom for all women will not be fully achieved until prostitution no longer exists. I will now give you snapshots of my life and of my mom's life to illustrate the everyday violence which is pandemic in the lives of First Nations women and our children. And I feel like there should be something saying, and listener discretion is advised. But if there are those of you in the room that need to leave, I can understand why, and perhaps Rape Relief would be willing to give them a number.
Yeah, I have cards here, so.
If you need to speak to somebody. I don't, say this lightly. When I was a toddler, my mum married a very violent man. They wed on a sunny June day at First United Church on the corners of Gore and Hastings. While seated in the back of their wedding sedan on the way to the reception, my mom leaned out the open window to wave and shout hello to one of her congratulating girlfriends. My mom's new husband said, "If you want to talk to one of your whore friends, then go talk to her." He then pushed my mom from the moving vehicle onto Hastings Street. I can only imagine how this unexpected eruption of violence traumatized my mom, and on this, her very special day. The man she married was a professional ex-boxer who loved alcohol and who hated women. When drinking, my stepfather's violence was especially brutal, and he and my mom drank a lot. He beat my mom, he beat my brother, he beat our animals, sometimes to the point of death. One night, my mom phoned a taxi in the middle of the night. Taxis were phoned in the middle of the night a lot in our home. On this particular night, when she phoned the taxi, she phoned because one of our German Shepherd dogs was literally climbing the walls. She took the dog to the vet. The vet looked at the dog and he said, "This dog is having a nervous breakdown. Who did this to this animal?" And my mom was too terrified to tell. The dog had to be put down. It would not be the last animal in our home to die. When I was 3, we lived in a house on the corner of Jackson and Hastings, which is no longer there. And one day, while playing in the fenced backyard, I heard the back screen door slam, and I looked up to see my stepfather coming down the stairs with a German Shepherd pup lying limp in his arms. My stepfather seemed dazed and not to notice me, and I creeped slowly into the farthest corner of our yard so as to hide. And I watched as he walked over to a set of garbage cans. And what he did, I've lost my place here, and I watched him dump the puppy into one of our garbage cans. I think a vital part of me went into the garbage can that day. Violence, or the threat of violence, was ever present in our home. Our animals cowered. We all cowered. Looking back, my brother and I lived in a war zone, and he was my only safe person, my only refuge. My mom left my first stepfather when I was 8. Years later, I asked my mom how she found the courage to leave him. She told me of one instance when she and I were lying in bed together, and I said, "Mom, I'm afraid if you don't leave Daddy, he's going to kill Donnie." That was my brother. This type of fear I lived with growing up, knowing I or my brother or my mother could be killed at any given moment in our home, is a very real fear for Indigenous women and our children. When I was 10, another violent man entered our lives. He was to be my third and final stepfather. My stepfather found work in Terrace, so once again my brother and I were uprooted. One day, my brother came home from playing hooky as usual. Our new stepfather knew because the school had called to inform him. He beat my brother so bad that evening that my brother ran away from home in the middle of a Terrace winter night, never to return. I lost my brother that evening. He was only 12, and he had taken his final beating. My stepfather made it perfectly clear to my mom that she needed to choose between him or her son. His ultimatum to my mom was one calculated step in a series of strategically divisive steps designed to gain sexual access to me. My mother chose him, and she was to live with that regret for the rest of her life. By the time my third stepfather entered my life, I was not the most trusting child. It took him 2 years to gain my trust, and with it gained, he started to train me. There were many times when I was left alone unsupervised with this man. I didn't know it, but I was being snared. I craved healthy male parenting because it had been sorely lacking from my life. He knew this fact and he used it to his advantage. In other words, I was a sitting duck for his abuse. His affection toward me grew increasingly sexual over time. I was scared, I was confused, and I didn't know what to do. I didn't know who to turn to. Sexual abuse was not talked about during the 1960s. It would take another 20 years for that Pandora's box to be opened. I sure couldn't tell my mom. I'd break her heart. I feared our family would fall apart and would be on the move yet again. I feared, too, if I did tell my mom, maybe she wouldn't believe me, as her mom hadn't believed her when her stepfather tried to abuse her and her younger sister. My only solution to all of this stress was to take myself out of the picture. So I asked if I could go to a private girls' school out of the city. That way I figured I'd be out of harm's way. My heart sank when I was told I couldn't go, and I lived with an impending sense of doom. From ages 10 to 12, you still with me?
Yes.
Okay. From ages 10 to 12, my stepfather worked on me to gain my trust. He gave me his time and his attention. He bestowed me with little gifts and with his affection. He told me that I was very special to him, that he had a special love for me, that the rest of the world wouldn't understand. In fact, he could go to jail for how he loved me. It was to be our little secret, just between him and me. He used mind games in which he cast my mom in very very negative light. I became increasingly, and this caused me to drift from my mom emotionally. All of these tactics were to ensure I became increasingly dependent upon him for my very existence, and to ensure that I would not go to my mom in confidence. When I was 13, my stepfather told me he had to have me. I felt trapped. I felt defenseless. I felt overpowered and overwhelmed. The day of my first rape, my stepfather carried me over the threshold of his bedroom. The blinds were closed. I can still see it to this very day. That's how crystal clear trauma memories are. I was laid on his bed, terrified. I felt cold. My body was stiff, and my closed legs were my only resistance. He pried them open. He entered me. I felt the physical pain of my hymen breaking, but the rest of me was numb. I had dissociated as a way to protect myself, to take myself out of danger. After he raped me, he held me close and he told me how much he loved me. I remember standing in the shower, shocked. I looked through the open bathroom door to see my stepfather standing naked in his bedroom. He had become someone else, a dangerous stranger. In that split second, with my virginal blood tearing down my legs, my world as I knew it shattered. For the next 4 years, my stepfather raped me every chance he got. I was his captive. He trained me to please him. Over time, I began to believe that sex was really all I was good for. His abuse of me came shrouded in romance. His rapes only proved how much he loved and desired me. I became his girlfriend. I told myself it didn't matter that I wasn't allowed to date other boys my own age. What did I need with immature boys anyway, when I had a real man at home? Over time, my thoughts became increasingly distorted as my overwhelmed feelings froze deeply buried inside of me. My whole world was precariously balanced on a whole set of lies which were designed to ensure I remain his captive and to hide his abuse from the public, from my mother, and from myself. The foremost lie, my stepfather's rapes were romance. From the stress of it all, I was really afraid that I was going to lose my mind. Andrea Dworkin once said that incest is the boot camp for prostitution. Deep in my bones, I know this to be true. I was my stepfather's fuck doll, albeit a frozen one. I moved in all the right places. I said all of the right things. I moaned, I groaned, and I gave sexual performances worthy of Oscars. I told my stepfather how good a cock he had every time he raped me. He trained me for every trick I would ever turn in my life, all of whom needed to be reassured that their cocks were the very best too. Do you have any idea of all the orgasms I've faked in my life? Countless. And at what cost to me? Inestimable. The place I turned my first trick was the Princess Rooms on Columbia Street, just north of Hastings. As a result of what had already happened to me in my young life, I certainly didn't feel like a princess. And this trick didn't look anything like a prince. He was old, fat, bald and white, just like my stepdad. By the way, for those of you in the room who are not familiar with the word trick, it is a term used by prostituted women to name the men who buy us, and it belies a certain contempt we feel toward them for doing so. Men who use prostituted women are not dates, they are not clients, they are not customers. They are men who from boyhood onward have been taught that their penises are of paramount importance, and that, I mean, we can dress it up and call it the biological imperative, but I kind of like to keep things simple and speak in terms that perhaps those that aren't in this ivory tower understand. We live in a world which says men must have their way. It is the same thought that my stepfather had when he said he had to have me. He did not have to have me. Men do not have to have their way with us. This is a great, big, fat, and can I say the F word? This is a great, big, fat, fucking lie. Because it's been told for centuries, and it's time for the lie to stop. It's time for the lie to be abolished. In Canada especially, it is now time for change. Anyway, getting back to turning my first trick. Turning this trick was no different from being raped in my home by my stepdad. I performed and did all the things I had been taught to do to my stepfather. I had a sense of pseudo-sexual empowerment. Great, I thought. This is easy money. And I felt free. I felt unencumbered. I wasn't trapped in an ongoing abusive relationship. Or so I thought. After decades of trauma counseling, and I'm talking decades, it's taken me 40 years to really get to the personal being political and to be able to tell my story. 40 years, yeah? So it's been decades that I've come to know that every trick I ever turned was a reenactment rape of my stepfather's previous rapes. And you won't hear the other side talking about their lives this way. They talk in cover-ups. I started to do heroin to cope with the painful dehumanization of living in a world which had reduced me to being every man's fuck doll. The last trick I turned, and I don't remember all the tricks in between my first and my last, but I do remember very crystal clear the first and the last. The last trick I turned was in December 1972. I had just taken a handful of pills because I could no longer withstand the pain of being violated over and over by what tricks were doing to me unless I was high. It was a very dangerous thing to do because my ability to read warning signs was highly compromised. By that time, there was nothing left of myself to protect. I didn't care anymore. As I was leaving the bar, a trick came in. We negotiated. As we were making our way to his hotel room, I slipped on the ice and down I went. Not once, not twice, 3 times. And my boot swelled immediately. I asked the trick to hail me a cab. It was only a sprain and I could see to it in the morning. He told me it wasn't a sprain, it was broken. And he knew because he was a first aid attendant at a logging camp and he had seen such things before. He told me If I came to his room, he would call an ambulance for me. He seemed genuinely concerned. I couldn't bear weight, so he helped me to his room. The pills I had previously taken had quickly worn off, and I was in great physical pain. When we got to his room, it became immediately crystal clear this trick had no intention of calling an ambulance. He started to run a bath instead. Then he came to me and he started to undress me. I couldn't stand, I couldn't run, I couldn't fight. All I could do was cry and plead with him to let me go. My protests, my tears, didn't matter to him. What mattered most in that moment was his heart-on. To that end, I was nothing more than a dirty little whore who needed to be cleaned up before raping. After he raped me, he called his father, and they laughed over the phone about what he had just done to me. Afterward, I sat in shock in the hotel lobby, waiting for the ambulance. I recall feeling relief that he had only raped me. He hadn't beaten me, he hadn't knifed me, he hadn't strangled me. I felt gratitude for leaving the room alive. As it turns out, I had indeed broken my ankle. I was in a non-walking cast for 5 months. After being discharged from hospital, I never returned to the street. I couldn't allow myself to turn tricks while on crutches. I was terrified of being this vulnerable ever again. I crawled out of prostitution, as most women do, if they are able to get out at all. In terms of exit strategies to help me leave prostitution, none existed. Currently, there are still no comprehensive exiting programs to help women leave prostitution. And overwhelmingly, studies point to how Indigenous women and other women in prostitution want out. During the 1980s, I returned to the downtown east side to volunteer at a drop-in center for prostituted women. I was shocked by what I saw in that room. Most of the women who used this drop-in center were of Native ancestry, and most looked like death camp survivors. Basic necessities of life unmet is a gross understatement. Why? Why were so many brown women here in this room? Here on these streets of Canada's porous postal code? This question haunted me all the way to school, and it became my research question in my graduate work. In order to understand the overrepresentation of Indigenous women within prostitution, I did some digging around in the past. I discovered, as Indigenous peoples, we did not have a word, and still we do not have a word, for prostitution in any of our languages, which means that in our world and in our ways of being, we did not know such an oppressive system of sexual domination. We didn't know that a system could exist like this. Prostitution was not our way, and it is not our way today. The institution of prostitution came over with the European mail. Every fort and every trading post had them. European women were not allowed to emigrate to Canada for the first 100 years of colonization. In keeping with that big, fat, fucking lie of the biological imperative, who filled these colonial brothels? What women were in these rooms? To my mind, these rooms were nothing short of rape chambers, and it was Native women who filled them. We were not viewed as human beings. The colonizer saw us as savages. I can only imagine the sexual and physical atrocities that we endured because of this view. I dare say these same atrocities are still inflicted upon Indigenous women today because we are still not seen as being fully human. Prostitution depends on supply and demand. Overwhelmingly, it is men who demand, and overwhelmingly, it is women who supply. The supply side of prostitution, as Kathleen Berry points out in her work, Female Sexual Slavery, and if you haven't read this book, I highly encourage you to do so. She says that prostitution depends upon a class of devalued women. Powerful interlocking forces, such as the state, church, and newly emergent capitalism, undergirded each other to strengthen their oppressive aims, to subjugate Indigenous women to a devalued class whose express purpose was to meet male sexual demand. The state introduced the Indian and the Residential School Acts. The state built the schools and the church ran them. As an Indigenous culture, we are still healing from these genocidal atrocities. It wasn't all that long ago that the last residential school closed in BC. The church also forced upon us the nuclear family with its inherent patriarchal values. And these values were foreign to our collective way of living. Indigenous women's sexuality was treated as currently. We were traded to become the trapper's concubine and scout. I would like to end my talk on a high note because I look around the room and I'm thinking, oh my God, they're all going to go out and get drunk after this because they just can't stand what they said or something. But anyway, I'd like to end on a high note with a word of hope. I'd like us to think about me as a young woman with that broken ankle trapped in the downtown East Side hotel room. About me raped by Hudrick, who later laughed with his father on the phone about his rape of me. And about my gratitude in leaving the hotel room alive. I shouldn't have had to live in a world in which I felt lucky for not being killed. For feeling lucky that I was only raped. What I needed most as that young woman was to be helped to leave a world I felt trapped in. A world which told me that I was nothing more than a dirty little whore who needed cleaning up before raping. I needed to live in a world which saw me as deserving of so much more than prostitution. A world which said I was more than the crimes which had been committed against me, against my personhood. What started out in Sweden 15 years ago, known then as the Swedish model, was groundbreaking. A set of progressive legal and comprehensive public and health policies. Why groundbreaking? Never before had any country in the world recognized prostitution for what it actually is. A form of male sexual violence whose existence serves to further entrench gendered inequality, thereby denying women our full rights as human beings. Since Norway and Finland adopted the Swedish model, it is now known as the Nordic model. But it's not only the Baltic region in which it has taken hold. France has recently introduced the Nordic model. European Parliament has voted in favor of criminalizing the buyer as well. Ireland and England are reviewing it too. There's a groundswell of endorsement and support over in Europe for the Nordic model. If the Nordic model had been available to me when I was a young woman, my life would have changed for the better more quickly than it did. For instance, the last trick who raped me would have been charged criminally. I would not have been criminalized because I would have been seen as an unequal party, a victim of this man's sexual assault. Instead, I would have been offered victim assistance and monetary recompensation for the rape committed against me. I would have been treated as a person deserving of respect. As such, I would have been provided with a set of social and health programs designed to help me heal from prostitution and to begin life anew. By the way, I want you to know I am 61 and I am still healing from prostitution. And I probably will be for the rest of my life. As Andrea Dworkin said, nobody gets out of prostitution whole. Anyway, getting back to my story. I wouldn't have had to feel trapped and despairing. I wouldn't have had to crawl out of prostitution, feeling shamed, lost, and desperately alone. I would have been offered hope for a future in which I could live without being prostituted. Canada would do well to offer such a future to women living on our soil, especially when it comes to the plight of prostituted Indigenous women. I would like to end with a quote that I think I'm going to tattoo somewhere on me. Seriously, it's my favorite quote, and it says it all for me. Strategies to confront sexual exploitation should be as global as the economy is international, and as the dimensions of women's subordination are universal, and as radical as is the rootedness of the prostitution of sexuality. As domination produces despair, struggle for liberation is an act of hope. Hope shatters the conviction that domination is inevitable, especially in the case of sexual exploitation, particularly in regard to prostitution. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing your story with us, Jackie and Summer. I know it's at risk to yourselves, and we're really grateful and honored that you're here with us. I think the most interesting kind of turn of events in the media landscape right now on this discourse is surrounding language. And I just wanted to ask, Summer, if you had any thoughts on the use of the term sex worker versus prostituted woman, and the kinds of words thrown around a lot in the discourse, like agency and choice. If you could speak to the issue of language right now.
Yes, I have it. I think when you talk about sex work, you're implying that it's a legitimate job, that you're implying that she's there by her own free choice, that you're implying that there's legislation and legitimacy. When you use the term prostituted, you're talking about a term and you're changing the reflection to be and include something that is being done to her rather than something that she has control over. And in the work that we do at Rape Relief, we choose to use prostituted. We've talked about it for a long time, which is the best word: sex work, sex trade, sex worker, prostituted, sexual exploitation. And the one that represents the concept of violence against women is prostituted woman. Daisy has some things to add to it.
Okay.
Cool.
I just think as feminists, because we don't get acknowledged for our thinking very much, we learned it from Sheila Jeffries. So a woman in the collective 10, 15 years ago read Sheila Jeffries and then brought a criticism to the collective in our use of the term. I don't actually know what we were using at the time. I was in the collective at the time, but I can't remember what language we were using. So So what Sheila Jeffrey says is, at least with the term prostituted woman, it brings the perpetrator into the picture. It doesn't actually say man, but somebody must be doing something to the woman for her to be prostituted. So that's why we use that language. And sex work's not only legitimate, tries to legitimate it as work, but it then legitimates men as businessmen or clients. And as clearly you've stated, that's we think that's completely inappropriate in the context of prostitution.
Yeah, so just bringing the men into the picture instead of just making it about women and women's choices. We're trying to structure it so that we're talking about men and their choices in this discussion.
Jackie, let me do it.
Yeah, and I'd like to speak to that as well, in that it legitimizes sexual assault.
Yeah.
But also the terms, it's not sex. Really, it's about power. And the John feeling like he owns me because there's been an exchange of money. And once owning me, he feels entitled to do that which he has seen in pornography. There's no distinction between, we make a false distinction between pornography and prostitution, and there isn't. In one instance, there's a camera rolling, and in the other instance, there isn't. And when a John is in the room with a prostituted woman, he is enacting pornography onto the woman. That is my experience, and it is the experience of other prostituted women. So it's not work and it's not sex. It's the power to sexually assault and degrade.
Can I have a She's not me. It's also one of my biggest pet peeves or perks is when people say paid rape or make it about the exchange of money, as if the money adds legitimacy or lends legitimacy, when often there is no money. The money is never exchanged. She never sees the money. The money doesn't go to her. It's a total concept.
In the first instance, it didn't come to us in the colonial brothels,
Yeah.
and it's not going to us now.
Yeah. So the other thing about adding the word work to it implies that there is an exchange of money, and that exchange of money makes it okay. So like I said, and like Jackie said, that you're buying the body parts, therefore you get to do with as you please. So when you take the concept of money or payment out of the conversation, you can't call it work anymore, and therefore it takes away the legitimacy or the concept that rape is fine as long as there's money.
I hope that when you leave here today, by having shared our experiences, that when someone from the other side says that they're not buying a person, that they're actually buying a service, that you will be able to answer up to that. That you will know that they have bought a body that has been dehumanized in the worst possible of ways.
Thank you.
Just had one thing.
Sure, yeah. I know we're going over time, but I think the room auto locks at 10, so we're just going to try to stick it as long as we can without getting locked in here. So, and we'll have to transfer the public to ask their questions as well, because I'm sure you have many. So Yuly, yeah, go ahead, please.
Just with respect to the term sex worker as well as it applies to the issue of trafficking of Asian women, that really kind of masks the fact that women who are trafficked, whether Asian or not, actually, there was a report that was just published recently by the Federal Agency of Public Safety, which highlighted that over 50% of people who are trafficked domestically are Aboriginal women and girls. But in any case, the term sex worker also masks, the fact that women are still trafficked, and you can't call them sex workers if they're coerced. I mean, all women are coerced in some form in prostitution, but the issue around trafficking in particular is something that you can't really use the term sex worker to describe what is happening in that situation.
It erases the phenomenon of sex trafficking that's inextricably linked to prostitution. So, yeah.
And to all of our panelists, what do you think is pivotal actions that we should take as feminists and as activists in this community?
Yeah. That every individual can take home tonight and act on doing something or learning more.
Yeah, men can stop watching pornography and stop buying women in prostitution.
Yeah.
They can have their life also And women in the group can join a group, get organized, start your own group, write your politicians, do a letter campaign, get on Facebook, go on the Twitter website, start asking questions, have an opinion, have a judgment, share it, own it.
Because it affects all
join
of
us in
us.
the fight.
Yes.
Yeah.
Is there any questions from the audience?
Yeah. Let's do that.
Yes, so we'll open up questions to the floor, pass the mic if need be.
Probably yours.
My name's Henrietta. What I'm interested in is how do you make men your allies without, in the feminist movement, without making it another expression of male dominance? I mean, I completely understand that oftentimes the buyers and the perpetrators of the rape and the harm towards women are men, but their men are potentially our allies, and they represent the 50% of the population that feminists are. The feminist discourse tends to exclude. So how do we include that? I mean, with the common conception of feminism.
I think it's a myth that feminism excludes men. So that's the first thing I would say. It's also a very convenient myth for men to use against feminism. So I think it's actually a kind of an anti-feminist statement. Not that you are, but that the statement itself undermines. Because if women were in better conditions, men would be too. So everybody benefits from women's equality, because if you're on the bottom and you work with the people on the bottom to get what they need, it just by working with the people with the least, everybody is going to benefit from that. It just kind of works that way. At least that's what I think. But also we do have, for every belief, we do work with men. We do have a group of men who agree to feminist leadership, and they don't have a say in our collective. They don't have a vote, but they do agree to fundraise for us, and they raise thousands of dollars for us. And you can see them out on the street every month. And so that's one thing. We work with men who can agree to feminism and to agree not to have a say and power in our collective, and follow feminist leadership. So that's one way. And clearly we talk to them about prostitution. And nothing's stopping men from organizing their own groups to stop prostitution. And certainly if a group of men said to us, we're holding a forum or we're holding a protest, and it's because we support the abolition of prostitution, because we see it as not only undermining women's humanity but theirs, we certainly would support it. So I don't see it as a problem that feminists are not seeing them as allies. I think there should be more men who see themselves as allies to our work. And as far as I know, there's lots of ways in which men can even work on the abolition campaign. This event is open to the public, and lots of them are. There was a letter writing campaign to try and get your member of parliament to think about this. So those things all go out to men and women. And the abolition website is, there's usually some call to action on that as well.
Okay, thank you,
There is
Daisy.
really some good literature written by men in the abolition field that other men can read.
Another question over here.
Janine made a comment about police rescue, and I've been a self-appointed advocate for the streets of the downtown east side for over a decade. Not with any group, I'm a loner, I do it myself. And many of us have been raped by the police. And I've heard so many stories from people on the streets, gang rape by police, on all different kinds of women, not just prostitutes. So I don't trust the police at all. I've been abused by them in many ways, and I've never been taken seriously by them. And as an older woman living alone, being bullied and battered, and they just won't take me seriously. They laugh. So as far as this exit program, that I think would be a great idea. I don't think the police are workable in that area.
Just to make clear, that's I wasn't endorsing that.
Yeah,
I was just saying that's the other thing we have to fight against.
Okay, I didn't know that. You said that, and that was kind of the question was,
Yeah.
Did you mean that seriously? Like, I had a hard time taking that seriously. Because what I've known is that the police delivered a lot of the women to the pig farm and were part of the snuff movies there.
Oh, and there's no question there's a negotiation with the police too. That there are police officers who arrest the woman and then in exchange for the charges not being proceeded with, then she's got to service him. No, that's
okay,
absolutely
yeah,
true.
okay. That made me nervous. I just wanted to clarify that. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else with a question or?
But I would like to make a comment about that in terms of Sweden, when it implemented legal and public policy reforms. They did a coordinated effort among their different
social agencies?
Yes, and the police, and medicine, and the police had to be re-educated concerning prostitution, and they were really reluctant within the first year to be re-educated. They didn't want to arrest Johns. They have since changed their mind. It's really important, education. So I don't, even though as an Indigenous woman, I almost have a genetic distrust of the police, but I do believe that there is hope, and that they can be re-educated, because I don't believe that every police officer is a John. I know that some are, and some are rapists as well.
But our women police officers as well, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So anyway, I just wanted to say that change doesn't happen overnight, and Sweden proved it, but it can be done.
Thank you. Yeah, we're gonna have to wrap up, unfortunately, but I just wanted to take a second to talk about just a bit about our Guerrilla Feminist Collective and bringing this event tonight. And I want to thank all the panelists so much. You are all so amazing and inspiring.
Wanted to thank you for putting this together. It's really important that there's many groups on many fronts that are tackling the issue of prostitution. We only have a year for the government, not even a year to convince the federal government of the Nordic model. So we really need people to be organizing different things and making their voice heard. So this was very important for us that your collective did this. So thank you very much.
Thank you. So yeah, please follow us on our Twitter, which is Q's After Bedford. And we started a hashtag, which is Questions After Bedford. And yeah, and share this with your friends and your partners, because this dialogue is pivotal and it's essential to our discussions, especially about violence against women and feminism. So thank you so much for coming out.